Voyager 2 went silent, what NASA found. When it came back, changed everything. They collected blood and saliva from every corner of the planet, hunter-gatherers deep in the African bush, fishing communities scattered across the Pacific, herders on the frozen edge of Siberia, villagers in the shadow of the Himalayas, tens of thousands of people from hundreds of populations on every inhabited continent on Earth. Scientists sequenced their genomes, letter by letter, billions of tiny chemical instructions. And then they did something no one had ever done at this scale. They built a map, a single, sprawling family tree of the entire human species, showing exactly how every population on the planet is connected, how we branched apart, how we spread, and where we all came from. And as the data poured in, the tree started to take shape, exactly the way they expected. Population after population slotted neatly into place, branching out in a clean, predictable pattern that traced our species from a single origin outward across the whole world. It was working. Every group fit, every lineage found its branch, except one. Buried in the genome of one particular part of humanity was something that refused to fit the tree, a piece of DNA that didn't match any living population, a piece that didn't even match our own direct ancestors, something ancient, something alien, something that should not have been there at all. And when scientists finally figured out what it was, it rewrote part of the human story and left a lot of very smart people staring at their screens in silence. If you want to know what they found hiding inside our own blood, stay with me and hit subscribe, because this is one of the strangest discoveries in the history of genetics. Let's start with the map itself. To understand why one lineage broke the pattern, you first have to understand the pattern. When scientists compare the DNA of any two human beings on Earth, no matter how different they look, no matter which continents their families come from, they find something almost unbelievable. We are identical, not roughly similar, identical to a staggering degree. Any two people you pick, a person from Tokyo and a person from Nairobi, a person from Stockholm and a person from the Amazon, share about 99.9% of their DNA. All the visible differences we obsess over, skin color, hair texture, the shape of a face, the fold of an eyelid, live inside a sliver of variation so thin, it barely registers in the code. And that tiny sliver tells a very specific story. When researchers mapped where genetic diversity is highest and where it thins out, they found a clear pattern radiating from one place, Africa. The greatest genetic diversity on Earth, by far, is inside Africa. Two people from different African populations can be more genetically different from each other than one of them is from someone in Europe or Asia, and there's a beautiful reason for that. Our species was born in Africa, roughly 300,000 years ago, and for most of our history, that's where we stayed. Populations grew, split, mixed, and accumulated variation over vast stretches of time. Then, only around 60 to 70,000 years ago, a relatively small group walked out of Africa and into the rest of the world. And here's the crucial part, the thing that shapes the entire tree. That group that left carried only a fraction of Africa's total diversity with them. Picture a huge library containing every book humanity ever wrote, and then imagine grabbing a single armful of books and carrying them off to build a new library somewhere else. That new library, no matter how it grows, can never contain more variety than the original. It's a sample. That's what left Africa. A sample. And every population outside Africa descends from that sample. This is why, as you trace human migration further and further from Africa, genetic diversity steadily shrinks. Middle Eastern populations are slightly less diverse than African ones. European and Asian populations, less still. And the populations that traveled the absolute furthest, the ancestors of Native Americans, who crossed into a whole new hemisphere as one of the last great migrations, carry the least genetic diversity of anyone. The map draws itself, one origin, one great migration, and a species fanning out across the globe, each branch a little narrower than the last. It's elegant, it's clean, and it demolishes something we've believed for centuries. Because when scientists looked at this tree, they discovered that the neat racial categories humanity invented simply do not exist in the DNA. The genetic differences between so-called races are tiny, blurry, and gradual. There are no clean lines. One population blends into the next with no hard borders anywhere. A person from East Africa might share more key genetic markers with someone from Southern Europe than with someone from West Africa. The boxes we built, the labels we fought and killed over, the hierarchies we constructed, none of them carve nature at its joints. In fact, there is more genetic variation inside any single so-called racial group than there is, on average, between different groups. Race, the data screams, is a social invention, not a biological fact. It's a story we told ourselves and then mistook for science. So the tree confirmed what population geneticists had long suspected. We are one species, recently descended from a common African origin, superficially varied but fundamentally united. Everything fit. The picture was complete. And then they found the thing that didn't belong. As the genomes were analyzed in finer and finer detail, researchers noticed strange fragments scattered through the DNA of people outside Africa, or chunks of code that looked human, but not quite. Not like any living population, and critically, not like the ancestors we knew about either. These fragments were older, weirder, structured differently, as if they'd been spliced in from somewhere else entirely. For a while, it was a genuine mystery. And then, through one of the most astonishing feats in the history of science, they solved it. Researchers managed to extract and read DNA from ancient bones, tens of thousands of years old. And you have to understand how nearly impossible that is. DNA is fragile. Over thousands of years, it shatters into tiny fragments, gets chewed up by bacteria, and becomes hopelessly contaminated by the DNA of everyone who ever handled the bone. For decades, reading the genome of an extinct human seemed like a fantasy. But scientists developed painstaking techniques to sift the ancient, broken fragments from the modern contamination to reassemble a genome from dust, working in sterile clean rooms with almost unimaginable precision. What they pulled off was the genetic equivalent of reconstructing an entire library from a pile of ash. And when they finally read that recovered genome, they realized these bones did not belong to our species at all. They belonged to Neanderthals, the stocky, big-brained cousins of humanity who lived across Europe and Asia and then vanished. And when they compared the Neanderthal genome to living people, the truth came out. Those strange fragments in our DNA were Neanderthal. Our ancestors, when they left Africa, met these other humans, and they didn't just coexist, they interbred. The evidence is written in nearly every non-African person alive today, who carries something like 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genome right now. The work that decoded this was so profound that the scientist who led it was awarded a Nobel Prize. We are, quite literally, part Neanderthal, a living blend of two different kinds of human. And yet, this still wasn't the lineage that broke the tree. Because the Neanderthal DNA is spread fairly evenly across everyone outside Africa, it fit a pattern. What came next did not. Deep in a cave in the mountains of Siberia, scientists found a single tiny fragment of a finger bone. Not much to look at, barely enough to hold between two fingers. But when they extracted the DNA from it, they got the shock of their careers. It wasn't human. It wasn't Neanderthal. It belonged to a completely unknown kind of ancient human, a species science had never even suspected existed. They named them Denisovans, after the cave. And here's the eerie part. We know almost nothing about them physically. A finger bone, a few teeth. A fragment of jaw. That's nearly the entire fossil record of an entire branch of humanity. We can barely picture what they looked like, and yet we know they existed, because we can read their ghost in the DNA of the living. Scientists went looking for Denisovan DNA in populations across the world, expecting maybe faint traces here and there. What they found instead was the anomaly the whole tree had been hiding. In most of the world, Denisovan DNA is nearly absent, a whisper if it's there at all. But in one specific part of the planet, it explodes. The peoples of Melanesia, of New Guinea, of Aboriginal Australia carry a dramatic, concentrated dose of Denisovan ancestry unlike anywhere else on Earth. Several percent of their genome comes from this vanished, mysterious species that we know almost nothing about. This is the lineage that didn't fit. When scientists mapped the neat human family tree, one branch turned out to be carrying a passenger from an extinct world, a genetic inheritance from a ghost species, woven into their DNA and found nowhere else in such abundance. Now, I want to be extremely careful here, because this is exactly the kind of fact that people twist into something ugly. And the science says the opposite. Carrying DNA from an ancient human species is not a flaw. It is not a mark of being less advanced, less evolved, or less human. That interpretation is not just offensive, it's flat out wrong. And every geneticist who studies this will tell you so. Remember, nearly everyone outside Africa carries Neanderthal DNA. Being a blend of ancient human lineages isn't the exception. It is the human condition. What makes the Denisovan story remarkable isn't that it makes one group different in some hierarchy. It's that it makes them a living bridge to a lost chapter of our species. We're tooled custodians of genetic material from a people the rest of us lost entirely. And astonishingly, some of that inherited DNA turned out to be useful. Certain Denisovan gene variants passed down to modern populations appear to help the body cope with specific environments, a genetic gift from an extinct cousin that natural selection kept because it helped people survive. That inheritance isn't a defect. In some ways, it's a superpower, forged tens of thousands of years ago and carried forward in the blood of the living. And there's a jaw-dropping real example of this. High on the Tibetan plateau, where the air is so thin that most people would fall dangerously ill, the local populations thrive. They live and work at altitudes that would leave lowlanders gasping, dizzy, and sick. For years, scientists wondered how their bodies managed it. When they looked at the DNA, they found the answer, and it was almost unbelievable. A specific gene variant that helps Tibetans use oxygen efficiently at extreme elevation turned out to be a gift from the Denisovans. An extinct species, known from a single finger bone, reached across tens of thousands of years and handed a living population the exact genetic tool it needed to conquer the roof of the world. That is not the story of a lineage that's lesser. That's the story of a lineage that inherited a treasure the rest of us lost. Being a blend of ancient humans isn't a weakness in the human story. Over and over, it turns out to be one of its greatest strengths. There's a perfect example that exposes how backwards our racial thinking really is. Certain genetic traits do cluster in some populations, and at first glance, that can look like it supports the idea of biological race. Take the sickle cell trait, which appears more often in people with West African ancestry. For a long time, people treated it as a racial marker, but when scientists looked closer, the real story emerged, and it had nothing to do with race. The sickle cell variant is common in regions where malaria was a deadly, constant threat, because carrying a single copy of it protects against malaria. Natural selection favored it anywhere malaria was a killer, regardless of what we would label the people living there. That's why the same protective trait also shows up in parts of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and India. It didn't spread along racial lines. It spread along the path of a mosquito-borne disease. Two people we'd sort into completely different racial boxes might both carry it, while two people we'd call the same race might not, depending entirely on where their ancestors lived and what threats they faced. The traits that actually cluster in populations track ancient environments and diseases, not the racial categories we invented. And the traits we obsess over, the visible ones, are precisely the ones that tell you the least about the deep, complex biology underneath. You cannot look at a person and read their intelligence, their health, their talents, or their potential. Those things vary enormously within every single population on Earth, distributed with total indifference to how someone looks. And once scientists knew to look for ghosts, they started finding them everywhere, and the clean tree unraveled into something far stranger and more beautiful. Back in Africa, in the very cradle of our species, researchers found hints of yet another vanished lineage. Evidence in the DNA of some West African populations suggested that their ancestors, too, had interbred with an ancient, unknown kind of human, a so-called ghost population that left no bones we've ever identified. No name, no face, only a signature buried in the genome of their descendants. And then there's the other end of the story, the deepest root of all. Among the peoples of southern Africa, the Kowe and San communities, scientists found a lineage so old that it splits off near the very base of the entire human family tree. Their ancestral line diverged from the rest of humanity earlier than almost any other living group, making them one of the oldest continuous branches of our species, still walking the earth. They are not a footnote to human history. In a very real sense, they carry the deepest surviving memory of it. So the map that started out as a clean, branching tree revealed itself to be something else entirely. Not a tree at all, but a tangled, woven web threaded through with the DNA of extinct species, ghost lineages, and ancient encounters between different kinds of humans who met, mingled, and merged long before recorded history began. So let's come back to the title, to the promise of the one that doesn't fit, because there are really two answers. And the second one is the one that matters most. The first answer is literal. Yes, when you map human DNA, certain lineages carry astonishing surprises. Denisovan ancestry concentrated in Oceania, ghosted mixture in Africa, deep ancient roots in the Kowe and San. Those are the anomalies that break the simple tree. But the deeper you go, the more you realize that the thing which truly doesn't fit the DNA, the concept that shatters completely under the weight of all this data, isn't any group of people at all. It's the idea of race itself. Think about it. We built the entire concept of race on the belief that humanity divides into separate, distinct, biologically real categories, ranked and bounded and clean. But the genetics reveals the exact opposite. It reveals a species that is overwhelmingly, almost eerily similar, distinguished by a razor-thin margin of variation that doesn't line up with our racial boxes at all. It reveals populations that blend seamlessly into one another with no borders anywhere. It reveals that we are all, every single one of us, mosaics, patchwork stitched together from multiple ancient human populations and even other species entirely. When you actually map the DNA of every race on Earth, the thing that doesn't fit, the outlier that the data refuses to support no matter how hard you look, is the very notion that separate races exist in the first place. And that realization carries a weight that goes far beyond a science documentary. For centuries, people used a fake, invented version of biology to justify unspeakable things: slavery, colonialism, genocide. They claimed that races were real, ranked, and permanent, that some groups were innately superior and others innately inferior. And they draped that lie in the language of science to make it sound respectable. The genome demolishes all of it. There is no genetic hierarchy of human worth. The genes that shape the traits we use to sort people, skin color, hair, facial features, make up a vanishingly small fraction of our DNA. Lighter skin in the far north helped bodies make vitamin D in weaker light. These are surface-level tweaks, evolutionary responses to environment, that appeared in the blink of an eye compared to the vast age of our species. They tell you where someone's ancestors lived. They tell you nothing about their intelligence, their character, their capability, or their value. The traits that actually matter for those things are scattered randomly across all of humanity, distributed with total indifference to the categories we invented. There's one more finding that drives the point home, and it's the most humbling of all. When scientists trace our shared ancestry back through the branches of the tree, they find that the most recent common ancestors of all living humans are shockingly close in time. Go back only a few thousand years, and you reach individuals who are ancestors of, quite literally, everyone alive today. Every person watching this shares those ancestors with every person you have ever met and every person you never will. Your family tree and the family tree of someone on the opposite side of the planet are not separate. They converge again and again in the recent past. You don't descend from one pure line. You descend from a vast, interconnected web that eventually gathers up all of humanity into a single family. The genetic distance between you and a stranger from the furthest culture on Earth is almost nothing. We are, in the most literal, measurable biological sense, one people. Recently descended, deeply intertwined, superficially varied, and fundamentally the same. So the scientists set out to map the DNA history of every race on Earth, expecting to sort humanity into a neat, branching tree. And what they found instead was a story far stranger and far more moving than they went looking for. They found ghosts in our blood, gifts from extinct cousins we'll never meet, ancient lineages reaching back to the dawn of our kind, and a web of connection binding every human being on the planet into a single, tangled family. The one that didn't fit wasn't a race that stood apart from the others. It was the idea that any of us stand apart at all, beneath the skin, beneath the surface, beneath the labels history handed us. The DNA tells one clear and unshakable truth. There is only one race. It's the human one. And we are all, every last one of us, branches of the very same tree. That's the discovery. And it's been written inside us the whole time, waiting for us to finally read it correctly. If this changed the way you see yourself and the people around you, do me a favor and subscribe, because next time we're going even deeper into the secrets hidden in our own genome. The story of who we are is more astonishing than anyone ever told you, and we've only just begun to read it. This is a subject people feel strongly and personally about, and rightly so. If any of it stirred questions about your own ancestry or identity, that's worth exploring. With real curiosity and good sources, because the true story of human origins is richer than any myth we ever invented to divide ourselves.